thank you all for being here. My name is Kunea Shorter-Goodman. I'm Chief Diversity Officer, and I'm serving as the moderator of the panel. Let me just say a couple of things before I ask the panelists to introduce themselves. First of all, thank you all for being here, and thank you to the college Republicans and college Democrats for deciding to air the film, and I think importantly, to foster this thoughtful conversation about the film. We know that there's tremendous controversy surrounding the airing of the film itself, not just here on campus, but across the nation. And we really want this opportunity to be a time for some thoughtful engagement. We invite you, if you haven't already, to write questions on your index cards and to give them to Ben or Briar or Patrick, so that we can get them up here and engage with those questions with the panel. We have a very diverse panel. I think this is a complicated conversation. It's a difficult conversation, but we really want to create an environment where people listen respectfully, even when people are saying things that you don't agree with, and so that we can air a variety of views. We will not be able to tolerate disruptive behavior. I have this written down on a sheet of paper. While we recognize the rights of every person to express his or her opinion, we cannot allow disruptive behavior, and so if you're disruptive, you'll be asked to leave. So we really invite people to sit in discomfort, because I think a lot of what's asked of us around difficult topics is to sit with discomfort and to sit in spaces where we may hear things that we don't agree with. But we will work on this panel to bring forth a multiplicity of views, and that's part of my job to foster that. So thank you all for being here. Let me ask the panelists if you will each introduce yourselves.
I'm Mike Spivey. I am a lecturer in the Department of Government and Politics. I teach courses in pre-law, and more specifically a course related to this, which is civil rights and liberties and issues dealing with the First Amendment.
My name is Sarah Oates. I'm a professor in the College of Journalism, and I teach on media and democracy.
My name is Doug Waleed. I'm the Executive Director of the Michigan Chapter of CARE, which is the Council on American Islamic Relations. It's a branch of America's largest advocacy and civil liberties organization for American Muslims. I'm also an imam as well as a veteran of the United States Navy, serving from 1994 to 1998.
My name is Delegate David Vogt, a Maryland State Delegate and United States Marine, served from 2004 to 2012, and left as a Staff Sergeant. Right.
Thank you all for being here, taking time out of your busy lives to be here. So, this is such an evocative, I think it's the first time that any of us on the panel have seen the film, myself included, and it's such an evocative film, and the context surrounding is so evocative. I think it would be helpful to start very briefly just having each of the panelists share your emotional reactions to the film, and then let's get into talking more about your thoughts and sort of reactions to the content and the substance of it. But where are you emotionally after viewing this?
I guess I'm first. It is very complex emotionally. I thought that was a very intense movie. There was a lot of killing and a lot of dying in a very short period of time, and a lot of it was very, very up close and personal. The only other thing I would add is that I guess I was a bit surprised by the film. I purposefully did not go watch it before tonight. I thought about watching it over the weekend, and I decided I wanted to wait until the night and react to the movie in real time, as they say. But I did go read various commentary on the movie. And to read the critics of the movie, you would have thought that this movie glorified war and glorified killing and sort of unilaterally praised the United States. And to listen to the comments on the other side, almost just the opposite. And I felt I could not react emotionally either one of those ways. It was much more complex. I had very emotions from all ends of the spectrum, all parts of the spectrum at the same time.
Yeah, I had a very similar reaction. I don't know if my personal reaction is that interesting or even relevant. I hate war films. I spent a lot of my life avoiding them. And I always thought, oh, what a great, liberal I am. I don't watch war films. But I think I've just averted my gaze, and I don't know if that's really okay. So I think in watching this, I think I learned more about the life of soldiers, and I think it definitely consolidated my opinion about if we're going to send people to war, there had better be an extraordinarily compelling reason. So in a way, I found it, and that's an odd thing to say, an anti-war film. I was also trying to think very hard about, how I might receive this film if I were Muslim, or how I might receive it if I were from a country that had been invaded essentially, or foreign soldiers have been there. And there just didn't seem to be much of the story there for that side. But I think that's why we have a diverse panel, and I will stop there.
This is my third time seeing the movie, and I saw some more problematic things with it, especially viewing it this third time through the lens of critical race theory, and I will expound upon those problems later on.
This is my second time seeing the film, and as a veteran and as a legislator that represents the very Constitution that gives us the ability to have this panel discussion, it was not easy to see the film the first time, as I did detainee operations in Afghanistan, and it was not any easier to see the film this time. It, in my humble opinion, embodies and in pictures the life both here in the United States and what experiences were overseas. And as a veteran is valuable for everyone to understand.
Thank you all. Let's jump in and maybe hear from each of you, and we don't need to go in any particular order, and expand a bit on some of the comments you've already made, but hear a bit about what you see, if any, are the strengths and virtues of the film, and what you see, if any, are the problems or concerns you have about the film.
It's a historic moment when academics won't say anything. I have to admit, I did keep my eyes closed through a lot of the shooting scenes, but I knew they were going on because there was flashing lights. Again, I come back to the point of I don't want to see that. Is that problematic for the film? No, because except in this instance, I don't have to go see a film I don't want to see. I also found it long, but I don't think that's a relevant critique. So I'd like someone else maybe to weigh in on an opinion here. I've broken the ice.
Nice start.
Thank you. Not really, but okay.
I guess in terms of the strength of the film, I'll go back to something I opened with as well. I think the film is more complex and more multi-layered than I expected it to be. It is not a simple good versus evil, we are the good guys, they are the bad guys film, though you do have parts in the film where characters talk about that dichotomy. The thing I perhaps found most interesting was the worldview that frames the film at the beginning is encapsulated in a scene at the very end of the movie, and then is also captured in the discussion and debate between Mark, who is killed, and Chris. And so let me explain that for just a second. At the beginning of the movie, the dad gives you his worldview. There are three types of people: sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs. And only one of those three types is good. The other two types are not good. And one of those types is worse than the other. That's when he takes his belt off and says, I'll beat you if you're a wolf. But it's clear even with that, he has a particular view of what people, what society, what justice should be. And then throughout the movie, you see the gore of war, the complexity of war, the inanity of war, and then you get to the part of the movie where Mark is questioning the war. And he has one brief scene with Chris when he expresses doubt. You then have the scene at the funeral where the letter is read, and you have the conversation between Chris and his wife, and he says, the letter killed him. Those views killed him. Being in a university setting, I found that I found it to be an amazing scene. We here spend all our time talking about ambiguity and complexity. I see a number of my students here in our classes. We talk about how there are often no clear answers. There's a lot of gray. And Chris's point here is that you can't have gray. Gray kills you. And then the movie ends, or almost ends, with a scene of him grabbing the dog off the child. We almost come full circle now to the beginning of the movie. So for me, part of the strength of this movie and part of the complexity of the movie is thinking through that worldview that's presented there and the clash of worldviews there.
So I'll go next. I view much of the framework to be extremely problematic and coming from the perspective of American exceptionalism. We have, first of all, we have a scene where he goes to get married, and right before the marriage, he showed 9/11 and the wedding, and then they're hoorah, ready to go get deployed, as if Iraq had anything to do with 9/11. Like, this is a false framework. Like, we know that 9/11 was an invasion based upon lies and illegal occupation. We invaded that country first because our president said it had something to do with 9/11. That was not true. That was fallacious. Then weapons of mass destruction. There were no weapons of mass destruction. The only person who says that today is Dick Cheney. And then to invade Iraq to bring them democracy, and we don't invade countries to bring democracy, we invade countries for our geopolitical interests. If we invaded countries to bring democracy, we would have invaded Saudi Arabia a long time ago, or Bahrain. We don't do that. So starting from a fallacious American exceptionalist framework, it says how somehow we are the good guys going to civilize them based upon the deaths of 3,000 Americans at 9/11, which in fact 4,500 Americans died in Iraq in a war that was based upon bogus pretenses, and at least 1 million Iraqis died as a result of that invasion. I mean, think about it. I come to see Detroit, we have 700,000 people. Just imagine if there was no more Detroit. This is the first problematic thing. The second problematic thing that I see in terms of the framework of this movie is this fake character called Mustafa. There was no Mustafa. If you read the actual book of the American Sniper, you'll see this was an amalgamation of different characters that was made up. This was a central character where there were Shia insurgents, Sunni insurgents, and then you had the terrorist group Al-Qaeda. Now, some of those people felt like we shouldn't have been there because we invaded their country. Imagine if Russia or some other country came, like in the movie Red Dawn, right? The original Red Dawn. Imagine some people came and invaded Russia. There would be some people fighting back, right? This guy, Mustafa, is a made-up character. He's not a real character. And he came to symbolize like a big symbol in this movie. The third thing that I like to mention is the bogus humanization of him as if he had some sort of care for the actual people. If you read the actual book, and I suggest read the book, especially that one scene where he's punching a few times, he could kill some people, and the kid there, and I quote from the book in relating to his wish of killing more Iraqis, including children, quote, "I only wish I had killed more," end of quote. That's what he said. So that this is American exceptionalist framework, leaving off history, and it is is based upon a bogus framework. I mean, so when we're talking about freedom of speech, right? Like I offer freedom of speech and dialogue about Iraq, but let's start from a position of a correct framework. Let's start from a correct premise. If we're starting from this framework in which people refer to as savages in the movie, which is racist as hell, then, I mean, what are we really talking about?
My first reaction to the film and to my colleague to my right would be to correct the quote that he used, that the actual quote is, to be honest with you, that was why I was out there. I wish I'd killed more because every kill saved American lives. And that was why I was there. He didn't say that he was hoping to kill children or innocent people. He was out there to kill combatants. And having a close friend that knew Chris Kyle himself, that all people have personality issues at various points. I don't think the movie tries to snow over any glorified image of men and women that serve in uniform that don't have moments of ill judgment where they make or say comments that are passionate or driven by emotion. They were there because they were given a mission and told they were there to protect a constitution that allows us to sit here, that allows us to discuss and disagree, but still gives us the freedom and ability to do such. The movie and the reason why it's an issue that we wanted to be able to guarantee the screening of the film here tonight was upholding a tradition that was forged back when a war was started in 1776. And that's, we may and we will always have disagreements. We will always have opposing viewpoints. However, above all those disagreements or opposing viewpoints, liberty, justice, the pursuit of happiness, life, and liberty are rights that will be protected above all else. The movie was to demonstrate, explain, communicate to a population in this country and around the globe what kind of life that men like Chris Kyle faced, how that affected their families, how that interacted in a global community. There are plenty of people. It wasn't a movie that was trying to argue for or against intervention or non-intervention as far as what our domestic policy or foreign policy should be. It was to demonstrate that there are human beings, and as a veteran who served in those situations, that there are human beings on both sides of this conflict, both in our service members and the nationals in the two countries where these wars were fought. There are plenty of conversation and arguments as to why we fought those wars, or why we went into those wars. There were opposing arguments as far as whether or not the entrance into Iraq was justified. One year it was an argument that there was never any evidence of weapons of mass destruction, and within the last 12 months, there's further evidence to suggest that there was, and it was destroyed and gotten rid of. Those arguments aren't why this film was created. Those arguments are not why we're sitting here tonight. why we're sitting here tonight, why this film is important, is I, as a legislator who enacts and helps protect a Constitution that gives us the right to disagree, and do so peacefully, not violently, like we saw, unfortunately, in Baltimore last week, but to do it in a manner where we talk openly and disagree openly and work together to work out differences. That's where American exceptionalism comes in. That's where the difference is. In one moment, and I'll be finished. And that's where, as a veteran who has post-traumatic stress myself, to be able to see, both in the wife and in the family and in the character Chris Kyle in the movie, now you all and everybody that's seen this film can understand a little more personally what the less than 1% of men and women that serve in uniform go through, and the families that protect.
Let's talk some more, and I'd love to hear from all of the panelists about the degree to which you think the film fosters Islamophobia, fosters anti-Muslim, anti-Arab sentiment.
Well, obviously, I think I should start with that because I'm the one most directly affected as the only Muslim on this panel, so I'll take that liberty and go first. And actually, I'm not even sure if anyone can even accurately even speak to that if you're not walking the life of a Muslim or a double minority here in the United States of America. But nonetheless, this film right here, and I want to go back a little bit in time to put this in perspective. From my perspective, this movie was a blockbuster hit, so it didn't even need to be screened here. It could have gone on Netflix if you really wanted to see it, or saw it in the movie theater. Like, this is my third time seeing it. So I saw it once beforehand, and I saw it on a panel I spoke at about a week and a half ago. Now, this movie, in my mind, has shades of the first blockbuster movie in these United States of America. In 1915, there was a movie called Birth of a Nation. I don't know how you've heard this movie called Birth of a Nation. So this movie, Birth of a Nation, was about what happened when there were some families that were in the North and in the South that had fought in the Civil War. And in this movie, Birth of the Nation, there were hardly, if any redeeming black characters in the movie Birth of the Nation. And then the aggressors, or the people who were framed in negative context, were black people, and many of them were white people in blackface, by the way. And then you had the good guys that came in that saved the day. And this movie was actually based upon a book called The Klansman. Now, there were African Americans who took exception to this movie being shown. And when this movie was shown, the people who were in favor of the movie argued that we have freedom of speech, we have freedom of expression. This is the First Amendment, it should be shown. And after this was shown, this movie, which was a Hollywood hit, there began to be backlash against black people because of the cumulative effect of what was going on in the United States of America. And many sociologists say that actually this movie, Birth of a Nation, gave birth to the second wave of the Night Riders, or the Ku Klux Klan, here in these United States of America. Now, why do I invoke this? Because if someone is in the status quo, and they're in the majority, and they have white privilege, the invoking of freedom of speech and anything can go is fine, but if you come from a minority group, if you come from a group of people with a community of color, who is already a marginalized group in the society, who already has government programs that target and racially profile your community. The Muslim community, if you look at EEOC reports going back last year, any religious group in the United States of America that suffers workplace discrimination, by far percentagely, American Muslims suffer workplace discrimination. When you look at from the release of this film until now, there have been 9 Muslim Americans who have been murdered under very suspect circumstances, it's like law enforcement doesn't want to call those hate crimes. Someone has road rage, 3 people got killed over a parking space in which there was no car in the damn parking space. A kid, a Muslim guy in Memphis, Tennessee drops his daughter off at school, and someone like me, an ex-veteran who had some issues, claims he had road rage and saw someone that looked like someone he fought against in Afghanistan and shot and killed the man. Now, we Muslims, when we see movies like this and the cumulative effect of Hollywood and news, where we hardly ever see any positive portrayals of Muslims. And when you see this as a cumulative effect, and we've seen Islamophobia get worse in America since 9/11, it's not any better, it's much worse than it was, then obviously Muslims are going to have a problem with a movie like this, and all we have to do is see on this campus and other campuses, where not even Muslims were the primary people showing or having problems with the screening these films, allies who aren't even Muslim raising their voices, saying that they have problems with it. When they used their free speech to protest the screening of this movie, all types of hate blog sites, hate emails going to the Muslim Student Association, which happened right here, as a result of people using their First Amendment rights of protesting the screening of this film. So do I think that this film, and actually the screening of this film, adds on to an Islamophobic environment that already exists in the United States of America? 100% yes.
So I'd like to react and respond to that if I could. You suggest that there is direct causation between increasing anti-Muslim sentiment and this film. Anti-Muslim sentiment didn't start with this film. I actually went back and looked at data post 9/11, and this trend has been increasing since 9/11. So I would suggest to you first, as a matter of causation, this film at best has a marginal impact. This started before this film. But second, even if you're correct that this film somehow has a special place in creating anti-Muslim sentiment, is your solution then to simply not screen this type of movie? My general view is that more speech is better than less speech. In our history, when the Supreme Court has said we want to restrict speech, it appears that even more bad things happen as a result of this. And then one final thing that I want to say about freedom of speech, to make sure that we are all clear about what the First Amendment says and what freedom of speech means. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the right to speech. That First Amendment is incorporated against the states through the 14th Amendment. And so states cannot abridge the freedom of speech. It doesn't mean that private individuals cannot attempt to restrict speech. And moreover, sensitivity is not censorship. There is a viable argument that, in fact, we should be civil and that our society is less civil than it should be. And that a bit more sensitivity to the thoughts and opinions of others is a good thing, and in and of itself is consistent with the First Amendment. But with all that said, I'd just like to restate the question. If your theory of causation is right, if your concerns are correct, is the answer to have less speech rather than more?
I was actually very specific. I said cumulative effect. I didn't say just specifically causation. I was very clear about that, actually.
Can I address the issue of the hatred, the online hatred, aimed at people on the Surrey campus and just generally part of it? And I think that I've actually found these, as someone who studies the internet and the intersection between the offline and online world, wow, just a fascinating and incredibly effective way of communicating. But we were talking about this before the event, and we were saying, well, is it the internet and the way that it inculcates hatred, or is it something specific to hatred aimed at Muslims? So I'm
reference back, not to cheer anyone up, that women in particular are objects of online hatred. The actress Ashley Judd is continually getting rape threats on social media because she's a Kentucky fan, which is just so bizarre. I throw it out there as I think part of the responsibility we're talking about here today is taking responsibility for what we think and feel and talking about it in a civil way, because that's the only way to move forward. I'm listening hard to what you're saying about the film, and I'm finding myself seeing new things and problematic things in it that I didn't see before. I'm finding myself enlightened in a way that I wouldn't have been before this discussion. I'm finding myself challenged, and I like that. I'm not always comfortable with it, but I like it, and I think that's how we move forward. So I'm just encouraging other people, whatever side you're challenged on, to keep rolling with it.
I would like to bring up the point of, in regard to public education. This is a public institution that we're all sitting in. If you go back and study the history of our country, the purpose of American public education, as established when this country was built, was in order to educate the populace so that we could have men and women whom are intelligent, learned, and capable of governing themselves. This was a historic notion and has since led to a historic nation and constitution. And part of that is to encourage the expanse of knowledge, paradigms, viewing other worldviews and ideas in a manner of willing to learn, but also mutually able to sometimes agree to disagree. Shutting that down because of sensitivity hampers the ability to learn. The conversation allows me to learn how any of you may feel, which I want to know, as well as vice versa. That's what allows education to grow, allows education to flourish. That's what allows us to continue to be able to grow and let that tradition, what made the nation what it is that we are willing to learn from each other so that we can continue to be a nation governed for and by ourselves.
Here's a question from the audience. Do you believe that the accuracy of the film would be sacrificed had Eastwood tried to be more sensitive in the portrayal of Muslims?
It'd be a completely different script, wouldn't it?
Well, I agree. First, I would concede your earlier point that the film has serious accuracy issues here. And if you do read Kyle's book, if you read interviews with him, if you compare the events of the film with the historical record, there are significant divergences, and you've named a few of those. We actually talked before the filming about whether those historical inaccuracies matter in terms of then the free speech issues we've been talking about tonight. And I must admit I'm a bit conflicted on that issue, because I think if a movie presents itself as history, then it needs to be accurate. The problem at the same time, though, is that these narratives are often contested. And you've actually heard a little bit of that on the panel tonight. Differing views as to, quote, what the truth is with respect to the narrative of the film. And how complete must the film be to be historically accurate? So, were there Muslims who did not behave the way the ones in this film did? And in fact, I was trying to keep count as to whether there were any Muslims that were shown in positive light. I was very encouraged when the one character invites them to dinner and sits around the table, and then the next scene, You're seeing the weapons cache in the bedroom. And I'm not sure I ever saw a positive treatment or even ambivalent treatment of Iraqis in the film. That said, it would be a different movie. It would not be the movie that Eastwood made. Now we can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it certainly would be a different thing.
Oh, certainly, man, different movie. That's all. I heard my reasons why.
I think, first of all, there was at least one instance, the family, where they were giving them the information about the butcher as defies, and the little boy was ultimately murdered. And then, what I'm assuming is the father, that family offered their support to the SEAL team and then paid for that support.
Yeah,
But the family itself.
And I got to say that, and I would be interested in your reaction to that. Again, I started off, I was trying to pay attention to those details, and I started off a bit optimistic with that scene as well. Well, we're going to see folks who are supportive of the SEAL team here, and then we get to the scene that he wants $100,000. It seems to impugn the entire motive of the individual of that guy, and at least it did to me. I don't know your reaction to that, but I took it out of the here's a positive portrayal and moved it back into the other category. Did I misinterpret that?
And what I see directly in experience is that while it may at first glance look as if he just had an ulterior motive, the level of risk that family was paying to provide any support whatsoever was life-threatening, as we saw. And that became, in both countries, a response to be able to at least feel some sort of insurance policy for themselves and their family. If I help these Americans, I'm putting my life and my family on the line. I need something to at least help prove good faith. That is what those that ended up trying to help were doing. And when that came up, no different than when we see hospital situations, cases where those come into play. The emotions are high, and it became a way that many of them, not knowing exactly how to move forward, wanting to help, that helps give them a policy, a way to be able to feel like they were providing for their family, while also helping root out the evil in the situation.
Let me make a comment. I say I wouldn't want to say one, but if Muslims would have been a part of the movie, I mean, I'm not sure if it would have been any more historically accurate now if they would have consulted Clint Eastwood, but definitely there would have been a better percentage or a better showing of positive Muslim images, because even if that one guy was still the good guy, and then there was another Iraqi guy who was working directly as a translator, you still have 2 out of several dozen Iraqis that are shown. They're seen as completely hostile and quote-unquote savages, that they were called several times, not just fighters, but even the person who the guy bought the ring from was called a savage, or he bought the ring from the quote-unquote savage. Or they used the term hajis, or you know, trained hajis, they were using that term in a racist, derogatory way. I think the framing would have been different, kind of like how the framing should have been different about Baltimore, when there were about 10,000 peaceful protesters in Baltimore. There, and these are focusing on a couple of, about 100 or so youth that got out of control. That ended up being the story, instead of why they went to the streets to begin with, because there's systematic killing of unarmed black men and cops are never prosecuted to go to jail in Baltimore. So, I mean, I think that's the problem with the framing, why if Muslims were, if Clint Eastwood had gone to one, or I give another example. And I'm a Muslim, so I know this. So even something as simple as when they're in Fallujah in northern Iraq, those are Sunni Arab Muslims. How the women were dressed, and they were shown and dressed like women from southern Iraq, and they were dressed like Shia Muslims. Like any Muslim who knows about Iraq and the Muslim world can tell, like I'm looking at them like Fallujah, it was like, wow, like it doesn't even look right. Like if you're a Muslim, you can just look at it and just tell automatically that there's even just a number of like small things just were just inaccurate. Not just big, from small things to big things were just very inaccurate.
So can I ask you this? Do you think this movie is unique in that, in terms of war movies? Because I'm from the Vietnam generation. I was actually the last class that was drafted. The only thing nice I actually have to say about Richard Nixon is he ended the draft that year, and I got to go to college, and I didn't have to go to Vietnam. But I then waited. Then I watched movies 15 years later about Vietnam. There's it seems to me a characterization of the Vietnamese as the others. They're called gooks. There's other derogatory terminology. If you go back and watch The Deer Hunter, I don't find any good Vietnamese in that movie. They're all the bad enemy. And in fact,
kind of cardboard cutouts.
they are. They're all stereotypical kind of characters. And so I was running through my head tonight thinking about all the war movies I have seen and how the enemy is portrayed. Going back to World War II, it seems that this is kind of standard fare for Hollywood. So I take your criticism, but I'm wondering whether you think this movie is unique in terms of that.
Oh, it's definitely not Muslim specific at all, because racism is not just labeled against Muslims, right? And how we go to wars, we dehumanize people and call them names and show them a particular way that's easier for us to go into their land. So definitely, you mentioned Vietnam. What's interesting, is when I look at war movies, and this is kind of the difference, and this is where I think racism also plays a role, where you see Iraqis who are called as savages, right? Or you look at Vietnamese movies, you call gook, and they're called gooks. I never remember any movies when they were showing Germans or people Vietnamese using these types of slurs against Europeans that we fought. Going back from the cowboy and Indian movies and how they're called savages and these types of names to these types of movies, and again, this goes back to the framework of what informs American exceptionalism. And much of what informs American exceptionalism from my vantage point is a white privileged perspective.
Well, as a middle-class white guy, I guess I'm part of that dominant group that you refer to, and maybe I'm so enmeshed in that framework of the world that I can't step outside of that. However, that said, I would suggest to you that Hollywood is not making a lot of movies from the perspective of the other. The dominant culture wants to feel good about the dominant culture, right?
Yeah.
If we go to war, we want to feel like we fought a just war and we did good. And so that theme, it seems to me, gets portrayed whatever movie we're talking about. So the criticism, if that's correct, the criticism then is not about, well, we can criticize Hollywood a lot for a lot of things, but at the end of the day, the valid criticism is not about the dominant narrative there. It goes back to the justice of the war and whether America fights just wars or not, whether this is good policy or not. And the two of you actually seem to have disagreed a bit tonight on the justice of that war. And I would suggest to you that that's part of what's at the root of the disagreement on this film. That if you think Iraq was an unjust war and that we should not have invaded, there were no weapons of mass destruction, then Chris Kyle cannot be a hero. You cannot be a hero in an unjust war, right? If it was a just war, if we were the sheepdog protecting the sheep, then Chris Kyle can be a hero. But that's the debate that's at the core of this bill. Are we talking about sheep, wolf, sheepdog, or is that analogy totally off the mark, and we should be talking about American foreign policy and the justice of the wars we engage in?
Yes. Yeah, I think a lot of this comes down to narrative, and one of the things I teach in my when I teach media and war, we look at modern military media management, and we look at how wars are framed to the public, a huge part of this is how the audience accepts it or rejects it, right? Because you can't really have an effective war if the public isn't buying into it. So patriotic narratives, and after 9/11, this is really interesting from what you were saying about the justifications for war in Iraq. Actually, the New York Times did exactly the same thing, but no one would listen. And to me, that's the interesting thing. Why do people stop listening? Well, why won't people listen? Why does it take a film of a black man being hunted down and shot by a white officer to get people to listen? And black people say, we're being shot by the police. And, just as the internet brings us this, the internet also brings us witness, and brings us voice. And it's completely unfair to say to outsider groups that aren't part of what you would consider to be the elite privileged part of society, oh, well, you just have to bring your own voice, so that's going to work really well against a Hollywood blockbuster. But I do think that's where some changes come in. There was an interesting British film made about the videos that soldiers uploaded themselves. It was aired in Britain about 10 years ago. It's called Shock Jocks. It was on, I think, Channel 4, possibly Channel 5. And it showed the soldiers used to make sort of films and put them to rock music. And it was also would be films of them killing people. They were very odd films. And the documentary was all about why would someone film themselves doing violent things and then upload it to YouTube. But it was all about trying to deal with the experience, trying to come to grips with the experience. And the end of the film is very much about PTSD and about people talking. It really reminded me of Chris Kyle, watching videos or imagining things. This is the only world. This is what I have become, and this is the only way I can deal with it. And to you, it looks insane. To me, I'm just in an insane place. So I think that there is a point in here somewhere. Maybe, perhaps, that it is all part of the narrative about war. But I would encourage the as an audience, as a people, we can move beyond that.
So let's pick up on your point about PTSD. Do you think American Sniper helps us to gain a deeper understanding of the psychological impact of war, or what PTSD is? Is it valuable or have any virtue on that score?
I think it gives some of the public a glimpse into the reality of PTSD. I do believe that. I think that it's a national shame that the suicide rate is so high amongst veterans. It's higher than the broader society. That U.S. veterans are actually percentually the highest percentage of people in America who are homeless. And I think that our country and our government, we need to do more to help veterans that are suffering from PTSD and also struggling with other things from coming back home. I remember when I had my exit interview from the Navy, and I've told this to some people since even watching this movie, that we went through boot camp in Great Lakes, Illinois, then A school. Then I got qualified at my battle station and went through all of that. And I got really qualified and really trained about how to be a good sailor and man my battle station, do shore patrol. But I really wasn't debriefed. I really didn't go through a really good psychological eval thoroughly when I was when I got my discharge from the U.S. Navy. So I hope that at least one positive thing about this movie, it does show some people about the reality of PTSD. And when veteran groups talk about and lobby our congressmen and people in Senate about how we need to increase funding towards veterans, and perhaps this movie may raise the consciousness of a few people to send some emails or make some calls to their congressmen.
I agree completely that the film highlights an issue that is tragic in the nation. We do a horrible job of providing proper transition and services to our veterans leaving service, coming home from deployment even. And that's an issue that hopefully hopefully this film's at least brought a little highlight to that matter so that it can be resolved. I also believe that the bigger culprit that we run into when we see a film like this with the debate is not a lack of compassion or even to blame one demographic. On surface, I appear to be about as Caucasian as you can come. However, I've studied Latin American and fluent in Spanish. Half my background is Judaism, and I serve every day with very close friends in all walks of life. Even if we put it into perspective and think it was misunderstanding, I was not at all questioning the peaceful protesters up in Baltimore, but the violent ones that unfortunately did run away with the media. But making it about race is also a deterrent from the bigger issue, because while tragedy did occur, of the 6 men up in Baltimore that were arrested, 3 were black, 3 were white. So making it about race is ignoring the bigger culprit, which is a lack of understanding and compassion for each other, which is also an issue in the film, and why we may or may not be in a war. And having the conversation lets us address those. Ignoring the conversation just allows it to fester, as Langston Hughes himself would have wrote in a poem, that when they do fester, they just explode.
And my sense is that there are various perspectives on what you just spoke of, Delegate Vogt, but I want to kind of pivot a bit and talk a little bit, get you all to talk a little bit more about the controversy around the area of the film. And I wanted to come back to you, Dr. Spivey, first, because earlier you talked a little bit about the First Amendment and what it is and what it isn't. And part of what I discerned, but if you could talk about this, is that your take is that deciding not to air the film is not a violation of First Amendment. Could you address whether that's what you're saying and talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Part of my point is that when anyone is challenged with speech, they immediately say First Amendment. My First Amendment rights are being violated. My favorite example is most recently was Dr. Oz, who is criticized for all the things that he promotes on his show. And he goes on TV last week and says, "You can say all you want, you can criticize me, but I will not be silent. I'm going to stand up for my First Amendment rights." I'm sorry, he has no First Amendment right to be on TV and to promote any particular product. It may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing, it's not a First Amendment right. First Amendment deals with rights that you have as against government and their regulation of speech. And at least so far as I can tell here, there was no attempt by any governmental entity to restrict speech. And so there was no First Amendment issue with respect to that. That said, there is a general view, and you've heard several people on the panel talk about this tonight, of the purpose of a university, of the purpose of speech within a university, of the way that has been viewed by the court, and that generally more speech is better than less speech. And I become concerned when, with all due respect, certain groups say, I would be offended by this and therefore do not speak, do not have that conversation. I think we need to be sensitive to the attitudes and views of others and feelings of others. At the same time, it doesn't raise First Amendment issues. It's technically not a free speech problem in the legal sense or constitutional sense of the term.
You know, public institutions, we have freedom of speech, and then we have practicality of when certain institutions will actually censor people because they are afraid or they think that it's not in good taste, offending certain constituencies, offending donors, or offending a particular part of the student body. So I'll give an example. University of Michigan 2 years ago for the commencement speech, they had prominent African-American writer and speaker Alice Walker was going to be the speaker at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And then there were certain organizations that were in the community who lobbied and got Alice Walker taken off and canceled to be the commencement speaker because of her free speech. And the issue is because she, like President Jimmy Carter, compared the conditions of how Palestinians live in Israel to like apartheid. And for her elaborating on that, she was taken off and censored. So, and there's similar things where certain movies and certain types of discourses under free speech, like for instance, if there was a movie that came out that had a very negative portrayal about particular groups are called, well, I'm not going to use that example, but I think you all are getting to the point of what I'm saying. That there are certain types of speech that public institutions simply won't allow or will frown upon because they think it's just not in good taste. So can those institutions do it? Yes, but do they self-censure? And are there different standards? I would say yes.
I don't think we found anything that Wallace Lowe won't let us do yet, but I guess keep trying. Is there danger in airing a film like American Sniper without a conversation, a debriefing, an opportunity to do what we're trying to do here? I don't know how effectively, but is there danger in that?
Well, since this is a center of academia, if such a movie is to be shown, then there would have to be a conversation. Otherwise, this isn't a movie theater. This isn't a movie theater like how you would go to an outside movie theater and pay admission and eat some popcorn just for entertainment purposes. I mean, this is a center of debate and discourse, as what's been mentioned by the panelists. So if such a movie is going to be shown, even though there's a lot of problematic issues with the movie, then there would have to be some discourse or some discussion on it for it to be shown. I mean, that's what's going on right now.
Yeah, if we were going to show Lolita or something, or other films that I personally would find, very troublesome, I think that would be it as well. I wouldn't say this is a unique film in terms of being challenging or potentially problematic or offensive. So I do think, unfortunately, you'd think on social media would be the place to do it, but I think we've learned that doesn't work. So I don't really know. It would be great if we could find a place to have a civil discourse, a more public conversation about things like this, but so far I don't think that's developed outside of groups such as this, which are structured to have this kind of debate.
This is Eastwood's film. It's the U.S. war in Iraq. We're here in the U.S. Do you think it's possible for folks in the U.S., American residents, to develop and produce a film about a war that the U.S. is engaged in that is more complicated and nuanced and balanced, I may say, in terms of the portrayal of the enemy, if you will, and the portrayal of the U.S. Is that possible? And if so, what might that look like, or how might that come about?
I just think you're going to have an audience for that film, and I say that with a really heavy heart and not, flippantly, but that's the whole problem, right? In capitalism and in the libertarian media system, where you got to get an audience, or there's no profit, so you can't do it. But I think that's where we're kind of stuck. We're telling these stories that people like to hear and that they're comfortable with. And tragically, most people were very comfortable with these stories. organization have? So I think that I just can't envision an American movie that's going to tell the story in that particular way. That being said, there have been movies, say, Private Ryan, and other movies that have talked about the pointlessness or to portray the cost of war. I lived in Britain for 16 years, and they were far more critical of the Iraq War at all times. And they had some more critical entertainment and news. And that's another issue. It's not just the entertainment. Far more important is the news and how the news frames war and how the news talks about anyone who's outside of the mainstream. So when news frames shift, maybe entertainment frames will shift. But I do see it as a real impasse for people who have different stories to tell and want their stories not to be told by someone else. Does anyone else have any ideas about how to break out of that? Aside from, the audience shifting its attention and showing appreciation and support for more nuanced views.
Other reactions to that question?
I just agree. Most of the movies we think about have a good guy and a bad guy, or good guys and bad guys, and good vanquishes evil. It's Star Wars redone in a lot of different ways and settings, but at the end of the day, in fact, I guess Star Wars actually kind of turns that model upside down, in that there are many that say we are the evil empire. The analogies of we're the evil empire there, but even there, most of these movies, it's the same narrative arc. It's a very simple narrative arc. It's not complicated. I still think maybe I'm a little hopeful that people might be interested in a little more nuance. I think maybe we're not far enough away from this war yet to get some nuance. If you look at wars about Vietnam, I come back to those again. There are many which are actually very critical of the United States, very critical of the war. The folks making the decisions are pictured as being wrong at best, and there's a slightly different narrative that goes in there. So it may be that we're not far enough away from this yet. But
It may be, but just one thing that strikes me is Vietnamese were never blamed for attacking the U.S. and for killing 3,000 people on U.S. soil the way that Muslims and Arabs have. So there's some fundamental differences there.
But we do have the precedents of how Japanese Americans were shown at Pearl Harbor. And there was some, even if you look at cartoons, look at things like The Cat in the Hat. I mean, if you just look even how some of the cartoons or books and how they showed Japanese Americans and called them Japs and made them look as if all people who were Southeast Asian were somehow sneaky. We do have a precedence of that, just not with Vietnam, with the Japanese people.
That brings up a really interesting point about trying to divide what's nationalism and what's prejudice. Because I think you had a really good point about the white enemies kind of get a pass.
Yeah.
And again, it's not something I thought about. Remember when I taught in Britain, we had a large Muslim community. There is a very large Muslim community in Glasgow where I taught, and it was good for me because I almost always had Muslim students in the classroom, and I do think if we could imagine the imaginary Muslim, right? If you could, when you're viewing these kinds of things, if you could try to take that point of view of saying that, okay, I'm making these assumptions on but let me try and get inside, how someone who's Muslim, how someone who's not from the majority might feel about that. A lot of it's about, who we want to be as Americans. And I kind of a little bit politely disagree with the delegate in that I do think Ferguson and I do think Baltimore is a lot about race. To me, you can't understand it. But, lately a lot of people, when talking about it, it's like, that's not the America I want to live in. I don't want to live in place and treats people that way. And so I think this sort of, trying to always include those people in your thoughts and reactions of taking different points of view. Because let me tell you, the British classroom, you couldn't do, weapons of mass destruction, it was totally justified, war of liberation, because the Brits would have laughed you out of the classroom. So it's always been, it's interesting that it kind of depends on where you are, what narrative is being told.
And just let me add on again, and much of this is informed by how we watch these movies. Race does inform a lot about how we see the world, whether you understand it or not. A lot of times, many things are implicit, and we're so saturated with images and a framework, and we don't even know, even sometimes what is framing our viewpoints or framing our perceptions. So that definitely is very important from my perspective.
It is brushing up against 9:30, and I want to thank our panelists, Delegate Vogt, Mr. Walid, Professor Oates, Professor Spivey, for engaging in this really thoughtful and I think vibrant conversation about this film. And I want to thank all of you for being here, for staying through this, and I really hope this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. I want to applaud the college Democrats, the college Republicans, for choosing to air the film, and I think particularly to have this opportunity for us to engage in this way. And maybe this can be a model for how we move forward. And again, I think the conversation can't end here. There are all kinds of interesting implications, and certainly we weren't able to get to many of the questions that were posed about what are the implications of this for how we engage with the veterans on our campus, how we engage with Muslim and Arab students on our campus, whether we're doing enough, whether we're addressing Islamophobia on our campus, whether we're supporting people who provided military service. I think there are lots of issues and implications for us that we can carry forward. Thank you all for being here, and once again, thanks to the College Democrats and the College Republicans.